called an historic deal. Negotiators at the UN's COP27 climate summit reached a deal to create a fund for loss and damage that will provide financial assistance to poor nations hit by climate disaster. But there's plenty of frustration too that the deal doesn't go far enough on limiting global temperatures. Let's talk to the Welsh Government's Deputy Minister for Climate Change, Lee Waters. Bore da, good morning.
Bore da.
What do you make of the deal?
Well, it's hard not to be pessimistic, I think, when you look at these outcomes, because there is a giant gap between what the science tells us we must be doing and what the political process can deliver. And the problem with these summits is you move at the pace of the slowest. And clearly countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia don't want to move. And I think that's a massive problem for all of us. But I always try and balance sort of the pessimism of the intellect, what the philosophers call, isn't it? And then the optimism of the will. Just because other countries are moving slowly doesn't mean we must move slowly. Because not only is there an economic advantage to us being first at the party, there's also a responsibility as a country that's contributed amongst the most to emissions. Our economy was built on fossil fuels. We have an imperative to act and a self-interest to act too.
OK, well, since you've raised it, let's talk about Wales' journey towards net zero by 2050. Currently on target, but you've recognised that this decade in particular is going to be a difficult decade. You've got to make some big, tough decisions. And, for example, Audit Wales, the auditor saying in the summer that the target of getting to net zero in the public sector by the end of this decade, by 2030, it looks perhaps it's not on course.
Well, we're on target for the emissions that have, we divide this up into 5-year periods. They worked out because they will hit net zero by 2050. So up to 2020, we think we're on target. The following 5 years, we're probably on target. And that's because we've done big things like closing Aberthaw Power Station, which made a big, big difference. We can't do that again. The next 5 years after this one, up to the end of this decade, that is where we are not on target. And that's where we need to be focusing.
Let's just talk more broadly then. I mean, there's been, a lot of focus recently about climate protesters and whether they are doing the right thing by drawing people's attention to the climate emergency that your government and lots of governments and councils, whatever, across the country have declared. But there are others that are saying, actually, they're getting in the way of people's everyday lives. I mean, what do you think?
Well, these aren't new arguments. Look at the history books and look at the people saying about the suffragists and the suffragettes. Very similar, and history judges them as being on the right side of history. About the time they were very unpopular. I think protesters are always unpopular with some, but I completely understand their despair. I'm not on the front line of protesting. I've chosen to come into politics to try and roll my sleeves up and try and bring about practical change. But I completely understand why, when they look at the science, and the science, is talking about catastrophic climate change. Scientists don't use these words lightly. They're pretty boring people on the whole, with the language they choose. They're saying catastrophic, irreversible climate change. And we're already seeing the impact of it in Wales. You only have to look in your gardens. There's something odd going on. We've been warned enough about it. We know what we've got to do, but we've got to get on with it.
Well, let's talk about particular policies, and you're concentrating on transport at the moment. You have been reviewing new road building here in Wales. When can we expect the announcement of what you're going to do with new roads here?
Well, hopefully we'll have an update of where we got to in the next couple of weeks. We're still working through a lot of the detail. And this is a really good example, James, of where politicians sign up to targets of net zero by 2050. But as soon as you bring forward policies that are necessary to achieve them, the consensus falls apart.
But to be fair, if people can't drive or it's harder to drive, they need an alternative. And isn't there a case sometimes of cart before horse that, quite frankly, the alternatives, public transport in some places in Wales is pretty rubbish?
Sure. And, I think the case is true in all the climate change interventions. It's true of home energy efficiency. It's true of recycling. You've got to make the right thing to do the easiest thing for people to do. We've done that in recycling, and it's worked. We've got third best rates in the world. Wasn't true 20 years ago. In transport, we've spent 70 years making the car the easiest way of getting around, and public transport increasingly more expensive. Services are not there in many places. So people will do what is easiest. And if we want to tackle climate change in transport, because about 17% of our emissions come from transport, we need to make the alternative to car easy. Now, we need to shift spending from road building to public transport to make that happen. So at some point, you have to make that change. The change is always hard to make. It's always unpopular. And we're working through now the recommendations of the Roads Review to apply that in the real world circumstance.
Well, talking about unpopular decisions, the new law change that 20 miles per hour will become the default in residential areas is proving controversial. Some people very supportive, some people dead against it.
It's not unpopular.
So you have some people dead against it, some people very supportive. But there's been some criticism that you're not painting a full picture here of what the economic picture or the economic benefits and disbenefits of there. Obviously, some people saying, well, you as a government have been pushing this research that suggests that money will be saved and lives will be saved as a result of this over the course of three decades. But then your own impact assessment also saying that there are potentially billions of pounds of economic disbenefit because people are travelling slower.
So, first of all, it is popular. 2/3 of people support it. That means a third don't support it. And obviously, we hear more from the people who don't support it than we do from those who do support it. And typically, you ask people, what speed do you want in your street where you live? They want lower speeds. You ask people what speeds they want when they go to work, they're less keen on lower speeds. So, people are people, and we all have our own contradictions that come to the fore here. So, I don't accept it's unpopular. It's controversial, and change is difficult. Just as bringing in seatbelts was controversial and difficult, we wouldn't go back now and change that decision. So the road safety evidence is very clear. It is safer, it is better for the environment, and it is something that we are going to be implementing. Now, are there going to be disbenefits, as you call it? Well, we'll see. The evidence so far is not suggesting that. We're talking about
your own impact assessment suggests that there could be.
Well, we can go into that. That's really nerdy stuff if you want. We have to follow something called the Treasury Green Book, and this is a good example of how, in a sense, anti-climate change mindsets are embedded in the economic formulas used by government.
Just to finish, I want to ask you about the second crossing.
You can't open a subject and just dismiss it, James. The economic figures we're quoting, I don't accept. There's an overall benefit, and if we are going to serious about climate change, we have to stop obsessing over these. A minute saved in the journey time is worth X to the economy. It's rubbish.
10 seconds. Is the crossing, the Menai suspension bridge, going to be open in the new year?
Hopefully in January we'll be able to get it back open for heavy loads, but then we need a longer term solution.
Okay, afraid we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us, Lee Waters. And that is